Good evening. Welcome to our 7th Robinson Jeffers Association Torhouse Foundation webinar. Our program tonight is Jeffers, Melville, and Niedecker, Poets of Transhumanity. I'm Tim Hunt, and I'll be hosting the program tonight. This series is jointly sponsored by the Robinson Jeffers Association and Torhouse Foundation. And I'd like to thank Elliot Bukowitz-Roberts, the president of Torhouse Foundation, and Aaron Yoshinobu, president of the Jeffers Association, for their sponsorship of the program. Also like to acknowledge Jim Carmen, who has recently completed his term as president of RJA, and who was one of the people who founded this series. And finally, Jessica Hunt is once again handling our Zoom technology. And you don't see her, but you are glad she's there, as I am. Our guests tonight are Lisa New. She is recently retired from Harvard University, where she was Powell M. Cabot Professor of American Literature, and she is now the director of the Center for Public Humanities at Arizona State University. She has also created and directs the PBS series Poetry in America, currently in its 3rd series, 4th series upcoming. And her books include The Lines I, Poetic Experience, American Sites from Harvard University Press. Also, we have with us tonight Gillian Osborne, I know better than that, Director of Curriculum for the Center for Public Humanities at Arizona State University, who also works closely with Lisa on the Poetry in America series. She is a relatively recent doctoral graduate from University of California, Berkeley, where she studied with Bob Haas, who's well known to those of us in the Jeffers community. And she is the author of Green, Green, Green from Nightboat Books, which is an excellent small literary press. Essays and experiments in reading that explore literature and the environment. We're delighted and fortunate to have them both with us for this program. However, they are not with us exactly tonight. Scheduling required that we record this conversation this afternoon. And in a moment, Lisa will appear on your screen and begin the discussion. As you watch the discussion, please use the chat box to comment and pose questions, and I'll be typing replies as quickly as I can through the whole program. And then I'll be back on screen after the discussion to say good night. I look forward to your comments and questions, and please remember chat box. And now the program. So Lisa, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I am so happy to be here with you, Tim, and with you, Gillian, to talk about Robinson Jeffers, and also to think about Jeffers in the larger tradition of American poetry. I find these days in my work where through the Poetry in America television series and also the experiences in online education I offer through Arizona State University, that the ambition to reach a very broad audience and to speak to the uninitiated as well as the initiated requires me to be ready to join on occasions like this, where Tim, I'll set this up for a moment. Tim very kindly wrote to me, having seen, I believe, a television episode on A.R. Ammon's Cascadilla Falls, which he enjoyed, and engaged me in a conversation and asked me about Robinson Jeffers. Maybe we'd put Jeffers on in the TV show. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting idea. I didn't really know very much about Jeffers relative to my depth of knowledge on other things. And so when Tim invited me to do a webinar on Jeffers, I demurred a little bit, but in the spirit of a spirit that that suits me now at this part of my career, the spirit of always maintaining curiosity, of being a bit done with expertise, and even maybe having put aside the demands of originality in service to reaching that that larger audience. I said, sure, let's have a conversation about Robinson Jeffers, but I need my wing woman, Gillian Osborne, with whom I've worked now for several years writing curriculum and recording curriculum, and especially working on literatures of the environment together. And it was in that context that Gillian, in fact, began to teach me about Robinson Jeffers. And as the days clicked off and we got nearer to this event, I got a little nervous, what with my thinness, my rich appreciation, but not deep knowledge of Jeffers. And I said, Gillian, and as Gillian has done before, she curated for us a selection of Jeffers poems and also some selections from two other poets, from Lorine Niedecker and from Herman Melville, whom we determined spoke to in various ways, at least to us, spoke to the concerns of Jeffers and are illuminated by Jeffers, and that and so very happy to open this conversation with Gillian by my side. The big question that I take it those who love Jeffers ask, and it seems to me the right question, is what does he mean by the unhuman or the inhuman? And the question I want to raise is this: Jeffers has so much overbearing personality. Right? So like, why, and as we'll see with Niedecker, who steps so much further back out of the frame and whose voice is so much more modulated. I was reading Subjected Earth, which begins, it puts the reader in a state of agitation, where an eye can find no rock to rest on. There's a restless and disquieted mind, and a mind kind of burdened by itself, burdened by its impatience, burdened by its memory. Jefferson uses the phrase "too much humanity hooded." What is that? Too much humanity hooded my mind. It's like a, what do we call those things? Those when balaclava or bakalava? What are those?
I don't know.
those hoods. There's like a helmet. It's that humanness is so distilled and the pathos is ridiculous, right? So that the intemperateness of the discourse and the temperament, the problems of temperament that are present themselves in this poem are what I, as a curious reader of Jeffers, I want to understand better. And I'd like to get closer to, is it just, it's so hard to be me. I'm sure it's not. That would be a very reductive thing to say.
I don't think, I don't think it is. I think, I think one of the things that continually strikes me about Jeffers is just the scale of his vision. Like pathos is definitely one word, but he's, in this poem, he is setting himself up. He's contrasting these flat Oxfordshire fields that he's walking into his coast, my own coast, the coast of California. And there's something about the grandeur of the coast where he spent, most of his adult life and wrote most of his poems, just the scale of that kind of perched on the edge of this continent with the mountains and the rocks and the ocean all there, that sets in most of his poems, he's kind of this single point of vision surrounded by that vastness. And I think that impacts the way he thinks about the human also. There's also a way in which his vision of California, although he was in Carmel, which even then there were lots of people living there, still there are these opennesses in the landscape that he kind of situates the figures in his poems in, and himself as a speaker. And so I think he's setting up this hyper civilized space of England to, the edge of the North American continent, and thinking about the difference between them. But I think
so. Is that to say that in an older, more settled, more urban place, he is more with himself? He is too much with himself.
Like in a Wordsworthian way, like the world is too much with us, I think, to a certain degree. But I think he uses himself. Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, I think he speaks as a speaker apart from humanness, like in a poem we'll look at later in Carmel Point, where he ends, we must unhumanize our views a little and become, that's much later than this poem, 30 years later than this poem we're looking at now. But I think that it's more that the other humans are too much with him than he's being weighed down by just the weight of human history. And I think one of the things that interests me about this poem, particularly in that middle stanza that you pointed to, the too much humanity weighing down the earth, the other kind of grandness of his vision, the other scale, is that he's imagining a kind of prehistoric era of humans, right? And one that will come after. And I think that's actually pretty radical, and something that now, people say now we have more of a sense of the Anthropocene, or this era that we're living in where humans have shaped the earth. But Jeffers was so keyed into that in 1920. He was so aware of how much humans had shaped everything, and how much more apparent that was in landscapes where humans had been for a long period. Many humans had been living closely together for long periods of time. So I think that's interesting. And then also the way he speaks. So when I read this middle stanza, if sometime the swamps return and the heavy forests, black beech and oak roots break up the paving of London streets, and he's imagining this much earlier human history of the lifted ridgeways, the old walking paths in England, and few people, and then he addresses the earth. Would you be glad to be free? I think you will never be glad again, so kneaded with human flesh, so humbled and changed. So the fact that he speaks to the earth too, I think, is interesting. That the grandeur of his vision is, I think the way he sticks to humans as corruptors is just, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm not, yes. And whether this vast temporal prospect, this looking forward and looking back, you have in a way allowed me to think about a deteriorating world, a worsening world, a world that becomes that is growing old in itself, growing more meek, more decrepit, more servile. And of course there's a moral tinge to that. But when I read this, it also feels like we were always shivering by little fires, watching and that and in an email exchange with Tim, we talked about fallenness.
Yeah.
There is a kind of Calvinist primordium of some sort here that we could imagine. And
Yes.
you've distinguished, Gillian, between the California coast that may, I don't know, stabilize some sort of sublime equipoise of some kind, and versus the crabbed anxiety of this speaker's eye.
Yeah, I think, because I think what he wants to experience humanness from the vantage of being able to see outside of it. So, a poem like Orca also does that so beautifully.
But you're not saying, okay, in California, you feel more, you're freer from your humanness.
I think he is saying that to a certain degree. I'm not saying that at all.
Are you freer? I mean, this is an old, I'm going to say one more word, Tim. This is an old American idea.
Yeah.
This reminds us of William Cullen Bryant's poem to Cole, where he's basically saying, back in London, you were looking at little things, and now we have prairies and we can see God better. And that sort of cultural nationalism, perhaps for those who want to go from Jeffers to another poet, that would be an interesting place to go, to say, okay, is Jeffers doing the same kind of thing that Bryant is doing in that?
I think, well, just to say one difference though, is that one thing that is different with Jeffers is, unlike Bryant, maybe I don't think he's as invested in building up this sense of like American identity or nationalism based on our wide open spaces, or even kind of that.
What is the wide open space? Like,
yes. Yeah, I think for him, it's not so much the frontier or a place to be cultivated. I mean, that's the thing with these earlier American poets,
right, for sure.
Space, and they're saying we're going to send people there, and farm it or whatever. He's saying, I want to be where I can still see what wildness is. So maybe more Thoreauvian in that sense, but
I kind of like, though, the resistance of that. The resistance of the geology to his eye, where the eye can find no rock to rest on, but the little, let's see, I just got to move.
Little flint
speckled soil, that there was something about this landscape that was repelling his resting eye. Tim, come in, please.
Well, one of the things that would be interesting here, if we had time enough, and which would take us a while, but this, of course, is within a sequence called Descent to the Dead, which is a series of poems that he wrote in 1929 on a trip to Ireland. And this is one of the last poems written in the sequence. It's also at the end of the trip. And one of the earlier poems of the sequence, In the Hill at Newgrange, he talks about a burial site for an ancient Irish warrior. And in a discarded stanza that opened the poem, he imagines himself as dead. So the descent to the dead is quite literal, and he is writing back from a sense of having become as if dead at the end of this early arc of his imaginative career, culminating in poems like The Women at Point Sur. So this poem is both illuminating of a larger pattern, and yet it's also not typical. Which is part of what becomes interesting when you're playing with a poet, because not every poem will lock together. Because in many poems, Jeffers imagines that once the human wave recedes, as he does in Carmel Point, nature will resume its full vitality. In this poem, he sees nature as something which will be expended and used up, in that sense, closer to our contemporary moment. And the point at Carmel is that it's already happening, but he can imagine a moment beyond it, even though that moment is already passed. So he's suspended in these sort of multiple points of time and history,
Yeah.
if he can unhood his mind sufficiently enough to participate in them. That's, I think, where the hooded mind comes in that middle stanza. So it becomes less an argument and more a kind of a dramatic exploration of the relationship between these different moments of time and landscape and potential and consciousness. But it's both typical and it's atypical, which is kind of what's interesting about it. And this is partly why I'm so pleased that you're both with us tonight, because this isn't a poem that I would have chosen. It's probably not a poem that many of the others of us in the old network of people who talk about this stuff would have chosen. But it's, of course, exactly because of that, that it's interesting to talk about in this context, because it disrupts things.
Well, we're happy to be disruptors. And I would like to explore what it means to be dead. And that seems to me extremely interesting. And it does actually also stitch together the connection with William Cullen Bryant again, whose most famous poem, he wrote it when he was 19 years old, called Thanatopsis, is a projection into a world free of anxiety. I mean, I really feel the temperament of this poet. And I heard what you said about a kind of dramatic turn occurring, Tim, and I'm educated by that. But how many poets are trying to write prescriptions for our anxiety about and how many imagine themselves. There's also the poem The Prairies does this too, where one is posthumous. And that, being, and Dickinson does that as well. What can one see from outside time? And I think I might be diverging from the two of you a little bit because of my obsession here with anxiety. But from outside of time, where there is no sort of backward looking, there's something about this poem where I remembered impatiently that there's some sort of, it would be too strong to say corruption of memory, but something not quite right about the relationship to the past or the relationship to the future. And so I think I'm learning from the two of you at sort of every second of this conversation, but still very seized by the temperamental questions. And maybe, I mean, it's one hears in Jeffers this kind of righteous anger, Jeremiah-like anger, but also just suffering. And suffering is different.
Right.
Yeah, and also, and I think also at the same time, an attempt to look at death. I think he's also seeking a kind of unaffected view of these, basic fundamental features of life, life and death. And the moment in Orca where he talks about witnessing death, here was death and with terror, yet it looked clean and bright. It was beautiful. Why? Because there was nothing human involved, suffering, nor causing, no lies, no smirk, no malice. And again, in Vulture at the end, where he's imagining what it would be like to be eaten by a bird. I think those are two moments where he's trying to think about what would an pathos infused death look like? What would human death look like if it were dehumanized in a sense, and just set within a larger landscape of life and death that surrounds us? Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, and what is he disburdening? What are the features of the human that his performance of its unsatisfactoriness reveals?
And at the risk of throwing us toward a poem which is not in our packet.
That's okay, let's hear it.
There's an early poem from about 1920 that he never published called Metempsychosis.
Interesting.
In which he imagines death as becoming one with the coastal environment. He becomes the creeks and the trees and whatnot.
Wow.
The problem is that he's simultaneously writing a poem that goes in the same, almost the same month, where he's dealing with the problem of consciousness. So the only way to be peacefully at one with the natural world is to cease being conscious.
Yeah.
The only way to be aware of the natural world and its beauty, which is God, which is redemption, is to be conscious, but then you are back in time and pain.
Right.
Or as he puts it in Continence In, the simultaneity of the God as the eye that watched and the tides of fire that is the basis of being.
Yeah.
So how do you resolve that dichotomy or that dilemma, or turn that into a productive dialectic? That's the struggle that's infusing a lot of the dramas of consciousness that I think go across the career.
Yeah.
And that infuses why he is so concerned with wanting to validate natural process as an ongoing redemptive feature, because that transcends the individual.
Yes.
It's a very unstable mix.
But I think to go back to Lisa's observations about just his personhood and the anxiety. I mean, another poet we could compare him to is someone like Gary Snyder, much later poet, but who has the framework of a kind of Buddhist ideology that allows him to let go of the burdenness of humanness to a degree that Jeffers can't really. And he's sort of so the way that Snyder,
so interesting. I mean, Snyder's more like Niedecker.
And he's a much happier poet, because he can look at the natural world and not be so conflicted in the way that we see Jeffers.
This is Gary. I think Tim said it so well. And this might be one of those, I don't think it's a cliche, but it might be one of these truths. Melville would call it a truth, which is that Jeffers is a poet struggling with consciousness. And, and where consciousness itself is like a helmet, or like a queasiness or an anxiety or that sounds right to me. Consciousness is that. And that it's overlaying this other world. I was wondering, as both of you were talking about the eye, about the that sort of non-Emersonian or sort of somewhat Emersonian eye that is so important for Jeffers, where it's almost as though the eye is kind of detached from the heart and the soul, or that it has a more what would the word be? Clinical. I don't mean clinical. It operates. It may just operate in the world. Can we turn our eyes into something other than windows of our souls? And those moments where you feel the strangeness of nature, and I feel them, in those little flecks of mica or whatever it is in the beginning of that poem, that it's just sort of a retinal, impulse. Where he's turned the eye into something else.
I want to throw in one quick thing here. And I also want to make sure we get on to our two other poets.
Yeah, we're going to. Okay.
And that is, you may not be aware, Gillian, that Gary Snyder after Kenneth Rexroth died,
Mhm.
came out and said, Jeffers was one of my primary initial influences.
Mhm. Yeah.
And Kenneth made me never admit to that if
Oh,
I wasn't
interesting.
part of Kenneth's circle.
Wow, fascinating.
Just as Rexroth also insisted that William Everson, aka Brother Antoninus, renounce all of his admiration for Jeffers.
Wow.
Everson later recanted, regretted, and became, of course, came out
Yeah.
and said Jeffers was my poetic mentor and inspiration.
That's so
So
interesting.
Snyder, before the Buddhism, is coming from, among others, Jeffers.
Mhm. I can see that very much so, I think. Yeah.
But it's in those first couple of collections, not the post-Buddhist stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is really fascinating. And it also, because my mind, it is somewhat stuck it's feeling sort of productive in Tim's point about a Calvinist, about that Calvinist sense that, you get in Edward Taylor when he says, I'm a bag of botches, lump of loathsomeness.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Or Robert Lowell when he says, I myself am hell.
Yeah.
But that, that's been in dialogue with Buddhism and Eastern thought all the way back to Emerson
Mhm.
and Thoreau as well. And this dialectic between a sense of our vision as necessarily mediated by our humanness and that attentiveness to a world that is not us. I think it's that we're beginning to have a discussion about with reference to a whole set of poets. I want to learn more about Jeffers, but maybe I should say a few words about why I thought Melville.
Yeah.
Why I thought we should read Melville with Jeffers. And it is in part, of course, because of the angst.
Yeah, totally.
It is a lifelong question, and I know many other scholars feel they've figured Ahab out, but I haven't figured Ahab out. I haven't quite figured out just why losing your leg rips open the problem of your relationship to the larger world. Right? I guess realizing that you come in parts. That is really a digression, but Ahab's willingness to break through to bang his head against reality and to question his sight. And you provided in this, brilliantly provided, Gillian, in this packet, the chapter Candles from Moby Dick, which is one of these great Shakespearean soliloquies where Ahab would be the sea, right? Would be the sea where he would, if he could, forswear personality, and that's one of the great paradoxes of him. If he wants not to be himself, why is he so magnificently, terrifyingly, richly selved? So Jeffers for me is one of the keys in the chain. He's now a new key in the keychain of understanding Ahab, which is also say understanding Melville. And so here's my kind of, I think, most fruitful thought about Melville that comes from a bewilderment about him. And that is, these poems are so, again, armored. They're like carapaced. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. And part of what weighs them down is poetry itself, or human discourse itself, right? The language is elevated in the oldest, most human ways. And it's almost like this poet is, straitjacketed in a language that grows, whose pathos grows more compelling as it's conflict with what he's looking for a language beyond this human language, and instead he's just borne down.
And
it's so fascinating, and it's so torqued and tortured.
And I mean, very different from Jeffers, obviously. I think Jeffers did write more formal verse early on, and then kind of found his gait and these more open lines later. But it is so interesting to think about Melville turning to poetry, kind of writing something like Moby Dick earlier on, and then through these various disappointments in the market and his life and rejections and sort of not being received or understood in the way that he wanted to be as a writer and maybe as a human. It's difficult to read the poetry as anything other than like a turning inward, and really these as poems that are speaking to themselves in a really profound way, that are, I think, even though he continued to look for an audience, they're kind of just him having these conversations with himself
I would like to talk briefly with you both about pathos and or pathos. Yes, so many words one is never sure about. Pathos or pathos, and I think it's Maldive shark, I think.
Maldive,
Is it Maldive?
I don't know, actually. That's another one.
I'm not sure either. So this poem is like it's the pathetic fallacy multiplied and exaggerated. It is so drenched in human affect. It doesn't hold this terrible, dark paradox of the shark that's accompanied by the pilot fish. It doesn't hold it at a distance. It's like it engored. The very language indulges itself in identification and pathos about, the sleek little pilot fish, azure and slim, how alert and attendance be from his saw pit of mouth, from his charnel of maw. They have nothing of harm to dread, but liquidly glide on his ghastly flank or before his Gorgonian head. It's like Poe almost, or lurk in the port of serrated teeth and white triple tiers of glittering gates. This is it's horror. Literary. It's so literary.
It's so literary. I am interested to hear you say, I feel like of the poems. So this poem that we picked is in John Marr, his collection of poems that comes out in the 1880s. And there's a lot of kind of, ocean stuff, but this one, I feel like, I don't know if I see the pathetic fallacy, or even this one feels more outwardly looking than many of them.
Really?
yeah, like maybe partly because I feel like he's trying really hard here to get at, with the overwrougtness of the language and the thickness of these consonants just jammed in together into the lines, like each line is so compressed, but I feel like he's trying to get at, yeah, the shark, the horror of the shark. In an almost natural historical way, he's that line, the line like his saw pit of mouth from his charnel of maw, you probably shouldn't have both of those in one line, Melville, but he's just so interested, and let me try that again, let me look at that feature of the shark again.
So you're reading this very empirically, and you're saying we have a kind of archaic language. Melville's own idiom on his tongue is kind of archaic.
Yeah.
But this is Melville being empirical.
That's how I read this poem. Yeah, I think this is him really looking at what is a shark. And I think, the last line, pale ravener of horrible meat, it seems to me like that's where it begins, it begins and ends. That's what the shark is. And he's just really looking at that.
And it's we're in the same place, which is about sort of I and affect, right, or I and feeling, or I and horror. And I find Melville's overwrought feeling kind of Ahabish.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And I find him afflicted by his humanness, which is has the weight of human language and art.
But in this case,
okay,
is the contrast to Jeffers helpful?
Yeah, I think so, because I think this poem, if we hold it up to Orca, for example, I think that's the one to compare it to, because Orca, the whole beginning stanza is him looking at these sea lions and then the appearance of the killer whales, and it's this long description, and then unlike Melville, he does pivot directly to the human, when he compares the killer whales to the Germans bombing London, and then at the very end when he compares the death that he's witnessing in the natural world back to what death means in the human world, where it means war and cruelty and all these other things that we connect to it. So I don't think Melville makes that pivot really in this poem. I mean, he says an asylum in jaws of the fates. I feel like that's maybe the most, a moment where we could talk about what fate and what friends mean in this poem. But I do feel like unlike many of his other poems, and much of his other writing where I think the human is always in view for Melville, this one strikes me as unusual actually in that regard, and how inhuman and unhuman it is.
So then in Melville, which I think is underscored in Pebbles, the other poem that you put in the packet.
Yeah.
The problem is that from the human perspective, nature is violent and destructive, but it's also an emptiness. It is non-human, and it is beyond the capacity of consciousness to engage.
Yeah.
So the pathetic fallacy comes into play, not so much as a way, or the pathos is not so much a system for making sense or giving meaning to nature through the human.
Yeah.
It's a matter of dramatizing the gap between the two. So in section 3, we have here, for echo the seas have none. It's almost Venzian. Nor aught that gives back man's strain, the hope of his heart, the dream of his brain. You turn to nature and you say, give me something.
Yeah, exactly.
And it says, screw you.
Yeah, right. Which is what Ahab is yelling at the ocean about in that passage.
This is Ahab yelling at the ocean. But there's also something cleansing, something that I think does take us back to Jeffers, right? There is something about what Melville is calling truth.
Right.
That because does
Jeffers
not.
inverts it. Jeffers inverts it.
Yeah.
the irrationality, the destructiveness is within human corruption, not within nature itself, because violence within nature is part of the order of nature, and regarded from that perspective, functions as an image of beauty.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yes.
So they're in a sense heads and tails of the same coin,
Yes.
but they're not the same side of that coin.
I think that's right. No, I think Melville is deeply, deeply, deeply humanistic. He loves humans, even as he's tortured kind of by his failures in human intimacy.
What does that mean, humanistic? I think he's, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think what it means for me is that humans are at the core of experience in life for him, and the natural world in all of its grandeur and power is still a backdrop to human drama. You never lose track of the human, even in Moby Dick. Like the most kind of vast, you think of like the chapter with Pip who falls in the middle of the ocean and left there. There's still this human figure in the middle.
Oh yeah, but that's the affliction, right? That's why he wants to roll. He somehow wants that to explode that, and Ahab does eventually, right? The way you explode your discrete humanness is becoming food for fishes, or having the ocean tear you apart. But it is I find him, and maybe this is just Calvinism, there's something inescapable, but like Jeffers, there are moments when the otherness, that's a cliche, the otherness of that world. I love that in the hollows of the liquid hills where the long blue ridges run, where he's taking us back into the domestic. He's using the Blue Ridge Mountains as a metaphor but telling us, if you yodel here, forget it. Nothing will answer you. And there is a cleanness about that.
Yeah, I think,
that you feel in the verse of, and Tim pointed us to this third stanza. There's a cleansing quality to that acknowledgement of nothingness.
Yeah, and I think the final stanzas of Pebbles feel the most connected to Jeffers to me, because I do think these are stanzas where Melville is kind of coming to terms with inhumanness in a way that it's much, it's healing, it's the obverse of Ahab. And he builds to that by allowing the sea to be an eye, so we have an ocean where the embattled fleets repair, man's suffering inflictor sails on sufferance there. So we see the ocean and man kind of still there against each other. But then in stanza 5, it's the sea that's speaking, right? Implacable eye, the old implacable sea, implacable most when I smile serene, please not appeased by myriad wrecks in me. And by putting himself into the voice of the ocean, I can't think of any other time where he really, really does that, where he really allows the speaker to inhabit a non-human being.
There's that wonderful, there's my favorite chapter in Moby Dick is called Symphony, the Symphony, where it's, he does a bit.
With the whales or with the ocean? With the ocean?
The ocean itself. It's just the ocean itself. It's so gorgeous. And
beautiful.
So prayer's not unimportant here.
No.
Prayer, blessing, lauding, at that address that in Ahab's soliloquy of the candles, that address feels stuck in costume to me and stuck in human flesh, needed, as Jeffers says, in human flesh. But here, is there, Whitman would say that by singing, by praising, by uttering, by delivering out from the self, that may be the way, by poetry, that there's some release. And maybe then I would think of the I differently there, where there's some sort of release that comes from announcing, declaiming, singing.
Yeah, I think Melville is really looking for that in his later poems. And these poems also are written after his long, epic poem about
God,
which we don't have to talk about at all, but I'm just saying, like, he's interested in religion and what religion might relieve one of in terms of being stuck in a human identity. And you see that.
You're making me think, whenever I read Melville, there's so many words I don't know. Orm, I did have to look up Orm.
I looked that up too. I was interested. He wrote a story called Daniel Orm. Did you find that?
Well, no, I found the dragon, the Norse god, the Norse sea god, the dragon.
Well, I found that he wrote a short story called Daniel Orm, which at least one critic was arguing is kind of a self-portrait of an old man who's ready to die. So we probably should have thought about that more in terms of Jeffers.
But whenever I read Melville, where the allusions are so recondite, and at least for me, and many, and you just feel human culture also draped all over these lines. And in a way that reminds me of our initial discussion of those little villages, where those little human settlements. I'm liking Tim's. Tim feels like we look beyond, we look through, we achieve some purchase. I'm bringing a darker.
Should we pivot to Niedecker on that note? Because I think she's also interested in human history in ways
that sounds like a good move.
Does that sound okay? Okay, because so when we had talked about other poets, we thought of Niedecker in relation to Jeffers, partly because of their regionalism. And we could think of Melville in those terms too, I guess, like each of these poets is occupying a different space in the continental US. And so she's, in the middle. And then also
Michigan and Wisconsin.
Exactly.
Which is, such historically such bloody land, such harsh land.
Yep. Yeah. And then we also thought too, I think, I know Jeffers had quite a readership and was well connected and all of that, but he was also kind of a poet outside of these other poetic centers like New York or so, and similarly Niedecker is, she's not in a big city, and so they have that in common. But so we thought we'd talk about the Lake Superior poems, and these were ones that she wrote in the 1960s based on a car trip she took around Lake Superior. And I guess just to connect first to Melville, one of the things that interests me about these poems is just like the quick stitches of history. It's like you can almost, but you can dig into them so deeply, like you can move through them. And it reminds me a bit of Marianne Moore too, in the way she uses citation to conjure up these deep American histories. But so as she's moving through this landscape, we have some stanzas that don't have humans in them at all, like the opening stanza of Lake Superior's, and every part of every living thing is stuff that once was rock and blood, the minerals of the rock. But throughout the sequence, and I should say in the packet, this is not the entirety of the sequence, there's some poems missing, but there's a pivoting between poems like that and poems that are very infused with human history, like the next one, which moves from iron to human engineering and industry, and Sault Ste. Marie, this particular spot between Michigan and Ontario, all of the colonial history that is connected with that place. So when I read about it, I learned that it's one of the oldest, it's one of the oldest settlements in European settlements in North America from the 17th century. So there are these moments in all of these poems where you can go deeper into history with all the historical figures, with Radisson, Marquette.
And the relationship of those allusions to, one way to read this poem is to do what I thought was fun to do. It's like, okay, I better look up Radisson because I know he's one of those 17th century guys. I don't really know what he was. It's like, okay, he's a fur trapper. Oh, he was tortured. He was seriously tortured by the Mohawks and survived. And Marquette, okay. He discovered the Mississippi. They began to think of it as a trade route from Marquette. Oh, all right. That's why we're in big boats that are coal black, right? So we're getting the kind of deep history of this place back to colonial times, somehow Paris and Canada and a whole world. But there's something more radical going on here, as there is in Jeffers, in the way that Tim was describing it, where we are achieving some sort of point. The historical stitchwork, as you called it, is giving us, is marking a spot in relation to which we may go. And it's a spot, it's a spot outside human history, but attentive to it.
Or it's both at once. I mean, I think that's one of the things that interests me about Niedecker. I don't see the tension that we were talking about there. And there's no these poems are not weighed down by human history. It's just all there. It's all in the mix, and they're not, I think that the little section that has through all this granite land, the sign of the cross, beauty, impurities in the rock. That's kind of a perfect example, because you have the history of, Christian colonization, right? But it's also like the signs of things mixing together within rocks and these different, threads of different rocks within each other. And she's calling that both a beauty and an impurity that sort of undergirds everything. I find that very moving.
Christian is becoming data, right? It's becoming another substance like rock or blood that is of a place. And not a point of view on that place. That is pretty interesting. And she's not always, in total equanimity. But there is, as you say, there is there's an evenness, an evenness of tone, which also makes me wonder about driving.
Right. The way she moves through the landscape is, similar to maybe William Carlos Williams, like speeding along, looking out the window. But I think, the smallness of these lines, right, compared to Jeffers, you had brought that up at the beginning about, there's almost like, it's true, she's not in complete equanimity, but how much human interpretive energy can we import into lines? The Radisson section, Radisson, a labyrinth of pleasure, this world of the lake, long hair, long gun, fingernails pulled out by Mohawks. How are we supposed to feel about that? Like it's so compressed.
But are these historical meditations, or are these historical invocations?
I think that's a really interesting question.
Because there's a slight difference, because we've been talking about place in this sequence, which makes sense because it is Lake Superior and it's part of this drive. But the other dimension of it, which we haven't talked about, is the temporal time.
Yes, right.
So that these different historical locations and scientific locations and observations are also functioning to expand the sort of temporal awareness. And maybe that's also where we see her starting to align in certain ways with Jeffers, even as she also diverges from Jeffers. She has the impurities in the rock, where Jeffers would probably insist on the purities within the rock. I mean, they're still locating the rock. They're both understanding that we are made of rock and mineral. There's that geologic time. And then there's the final move in this part of the sequence. The smooth black stone I picked up in true source park. The leaf beside it once was stone. Why should we hurry? Home. Right. So we have the juxtaposition, the temporal juxtaposition of the leaf and the rock, which are not representing, that's the wrong way to put it, but which are evoking or putting in play radically different temporal frames. And they're calling into question the need to hurry, because we're already in a sense there, but also then where is home? Is this home, or is home a question? That last word is indented so that it suspends slightly, and it's syntactically ambiguous. So
it's so human and domestic. Hurry home, right? It's idiomatic as well. But why should we? I love this, Tim. I mean, it really does go to the anxiety that that is so problematic for me in my reading of Jefferson and Melville. And I think what you've just said is so interesting, in that it's almost as though as she provides us these different temporal frames, there's another cliche, there is a perspective that a sort of quiescence or a stabilization that happens in Melville and happens sometimes in Jeffers in California.
Right. So we're moving toward the end of our allotted time. As we sort of come to our close here, it strikes me that you could do something really fun with Carmel Point by Jeffers, read in terms of the opening 4 lines of that Lake Superior sequence. So I'm kind of saying to all of our folks watching with us tonight, hey, this is a game you guys could play at home, as they say. And then with Vulture against the last little bit that we just looked at. And you could do some very interesting weaving back and forth between Jeffers and Niedecker at that point. And
actually, well, if you want to go even deeper, I would say there is one more little poem in Lake Superior that comes after the one that ends our packet here, and it has an animal. It has an animal in it. It's very different from a vulture. It's maybe a squirrel or something. So you should, or it's a ground animal for sure. So you should check it out.
While you look for it, I'm going to share a quick anecdote.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
In 1987, the Jeffers Centennial, Gary Snyder read. That's where he confessed that Jeffers was one of his initial inspirations, but also William Stafford. And they were each reading a Jeffers poem, his Celebration. And Stafford, of course, who looked like he was 150 when he was 49, right? White hair, craggy features, and gets up on the stage. And he's, of course, very hale and hearty at that point in his life, but he's kind of giving it the I'm a little bit decrepit act. And the poem he chose to read was Vulture.
Oh, wow.
And so, the general notion of Stafford is that there's no pose in Bill. Stafford was a canny man. That was a great piece of drama, as well as a great rendering of that poem. So I want to thank you both for making time to be with us this evening. I think we could have talked for at least another hour or two or three and still been learning things from each other. And we, all of us in the Jeffers community, wish you guys nothing but success with the work you're doing with Poetry in America and your public humanities projects, which are desperately needed in this era. So bless you and thank you for your time.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
Tim.
much, Tim.
Bye.
Thank you, Gillian.